Look at the column. No, seriously. They had somewhere between 400 and 450 men with the Minute Militia Company, Concord, Lincoln, Acton, Bedford. Actually, I got that out of order. Acton, Concord, Bedford, Lincoln. So 400 to 450 men. I think we have very close to that tonight with all of you here. You are representing those soldiers who made this march in 1775. I'm going to point out something else. A place in the park that very few people ever notice, but it's hugely important. It's the field right across the way. Now, Liberty Street was not there in 1775. This was all one continuous open field. It was a much more open landscape in 1775 than it is today. So in that field, imagine a column, a line, of soldiers about this long. And I can tell you that they were arranged in two lines going across the field to the southwest. How do I know that? I know that because in 1939, before the park was created, there was an amateur archaeologist who was walking that field after it had been plowed for the first time in generations. It had just rained. He was looking for indigenous stone artifacts, flint tools. The conditions were perfect. He did find some flint. They were not from the indigenous inhabitants long ago. They were much more recent. There were 200 gun flints arranged in two lines across that field. He collected them, and they're now in a collection at the Concord Museum, where you can go and see them today. They don't just represent gun flints. That's not just, hey, isn't that interesting? This is the colonial tradition. What that amateur archaeologist discovered was the moment that those men realized they were going into combat. Standing in that field, watching over the bridge that was held by 96 British soldiers. There were other soldiers at Barrett's Farm looking for artillery. And those British soldiers were there to hold it, keep it in friendly hands, so that they could be crossed when they wrapped up their mission. The Minutemen and the militia were up here watching, content to stay there. They had heard disturbing rumors that shots had been fired in Lexington. But for most of them, that was all they knew. They didn't realize at that moment that some of their countrymen had already been killed. 8 killed and 10 wounded on Common in Lexington, just a few hours before. 9:30 in the morning, April 19, 1775. And the men there start to notice something disturbing. Smoke rising above the town. Now what was happening is the British soldiers found gun carriages, tents, and other military equipment. They set fire to them. Flames then spread to the townhouse, which then caught fire. At the urging of the local widow, Martha Moulton, the soldiers were putting out the fire. But the militiamen standing here did not know that. They assumed their town was being destroyed. An adjutant from the town of Concord, Joseph Hosmer, agitated at the lack of resolve and movement on the part of his office, seeing his home potentially being destroyed, went up to the colonial office, Colonel James Barrett, Major John Buttrick, Concord, Lieutenant Colonel Robinson of Westford. He said to them, the words of his granddaughter in her memory, "I heard a rumor the British boast that they can march across this province, killing and burning as they go, and that we will not rise to oppose them. And I'm beginning to think they're right. Will you let them burn the town down?" The decision was made to march on the bridge, and against those 96 British soldiers. But think about 96 soldiers, and look at all of you. There's strength in numbers, and they know it. Colonel James Barrett, your overall commander, gun plants to make sure their weapons are going to work. That's when they realize they're going into combat. Now, I also want you to think about this. When that column began to move from that field, picking up the Groton Road, the very road that we tonight will be marching on, the British soldiers saw the power that was coming their way, and it frightened them. And they began to retreat across the bridge. Some of them started pulling up the planks, realizing what was coming their way. The Acton Company led the attack. Before marching, Captain Isaac Davis of Acton, in memory of some of the men who served under him that day, he drew his sword and he said, "I have not a man who is afraid to go." It sounds like bravado, but when you think about what they were doing, he's calling out the elephant in the room. They were all afraid, particularly that front company. Because I want you to think about those orders. Don't fire unless first fired upon. Let's translate that into something more modern. March to within range of the enemy's guns and let them shoot at you first. We often assign a lot of courage and discipline to the British soldiers, but let's not forget the discipline of the militia marching down this very road on that fateful morning. After a ragged volley from the regulars, Captain Isaac Davis was struck dead. Private Abner Hosmer, also of the Acton Company, was shot through the left eye, died within moments. Major John Buttrick of Concord then gave the fatal command, "Fire, for God's sake, fire." Not a very military-sounding command, but one that reflects the horror, the shock of that moment. So as we march on my command, I want you to remember that for those two men, Captain Isaac Davis and Private Abner Hosmer of the Acton Minute Company, they went down that road and they never came back up. From here, the battle had just begun. A few hours later, the British began to retreat back to Boston, and they were pursued. As one of the militiamen said, they determined to go to the eastern part of town and take them as they came back. And that began the bloody fighting along the battle road. But this was where they first advanced on the King's soldiers and fired on orders. An act of treason, an act of rebellion. These were British subjects who we today celebrate as the shot heard around the world. Battalion!